Biblical history spans the entire course of time, from the creation of the world to the era of the early Christian church in the late first century. At its most basic level, it's simply the story of God fashioning a people for himself and redemptively interacting with them throughout history. From the creation of the world and the first human being to the fall of humanity, to the calling of Abraham and the rise of Israel, to the return of Judah from exile in Babylon, to the incarnation of life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and finally, the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit in all believers. God continually works to redeem a people for himself, a people he can lovingly bless with good things as they seek him and find their hope in him, the source of all good things. The beginning of creation. The story begins with the very creation of the world. When God formed the heavens and the earth, and then all the things to inhabit them. All that he created was good. But God distinguished human beings from the rest of creation by creating them in his very own image. He abundantly provided for Adam and Eve, the first man and woman, by placing them in a specially prepared garden, and he enjoyed unbroken fellowship with them. But this perfect world was soon poisoned by sin when Adam and Eve sought out to be their own masters and disobeyed God. Instead of trusting and obeying God, they swallowed the lie of the serpent. Who told them that they could be like God? The serpent told Adam and Eve that they could be like God. And they swallowed that lie, betraying God's word. And because of their sin, Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, and from then on suffered pain, sorrow, and even death. But thankfully, the story of God's people, it didn't end there. In fact, this was just the beginning. Sadly, the curse brought sin. Sadly, the curse of sin brought into the world by Adam and Eve was passed down to all of their descendants. And every human being is bent, so to speak, just like their ancestors. This can be seen as early as their first child, Cain, who killed his brother out of jealousy. The curse of sin continued until the whole world was so wicked that God chose to wipe it out and start all over. In a sense, with a new people, a people descended from a righteous man named Noah. God instructed Noah to build a giant boat to save his family and pairs of every kind of animal living on the earth. Then God made it rain for 40 days, until the whole earth was covered with water, and every living thing that was not on a boat, including human beings, died. After the flood water subsided, Noah and his family left the boat to start a new humanity. God told them to multiply and to fill the earth, and he promised never again to destroy the earth with a flood. Noah's descendants multiplied. Everyone spoke one single language, enabling them to work together. So they decided to build a great tower to the heavens, a testimony to their own greatness. But God chose to confuse them with a different language, making it virtually impossible for them to continue with their great project, since they could no longer understand each other. Let me make sure I'm pronouncing this right. Okay. As a result, the people soon disappeared and spread out all over the earth, which is God had commanded them to do in the first place. All right, God chosen family. 21, whatever. I'm reading. It appears that with each generation after Noah, people drifted further from God. And God chose once again to create a people for himself. A people for himself. People for himself within the rest of humanity. This time, though, a man named Abraham eventually, this time a man named Abram eventually renamed Abraham. Okay, my train of thought's getting off. But okay, through this chosen people, God will ultimately bless all of humanity. Interestingly, the Bible does not mention why God chose Abraham. I'm looking for whatever's buzzing. Wait a minute. Now I'm thrown all off. Eventually named, okay, this time through a man named Abram, eventually renamed Abraham. Through this chosen people, God would eventually bless all of humanity. Interestingly, the Bible does not mention why God chose Abram. It simply said God told him to leave his family and his home country to go to a new land that God would show him. God promised to bless Abram and make a great nation from his descendants. And Abraham obeyed God. Thus begins the rest of the story of the Old Testament, the story of God's chosen people. I'm Reverend Ced. Thank you for joining me. Two people out there. In obedience and faith, Abraham left his home and traveled to the land of Canaan. God told Abraham that this was the land he was going to give him, and he sealed his promise with a solemn covenant ceremony. God also reaffirmed his promise to give Abraham many descendants. After an antagonizing wait, God finally gave Abraham his wife, Sarah, a son, Isaac. Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 91. Then God tested Abraham's faith by telling him to sacrifice Isaac. This was the ultimate demonstration of Abraham's faithful trust in God, since Isaac was the only son born to Abraham and Sarah the only visible hope that God would fulfill his promise and bless Abraham with many descendants. Abraham obeyed and God spared Isaac's life. Isaac lived much of his life like his father, sojourning in various places in Canaan. Isaac's wife, Rebekah, gave birth to twin boys, Esau and Jacob. Esau was older, but when he sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew, and Jacob then tricked his father into granting him the blessings that belonged to Esau. So Esau became very angry with Jacob. And Jacob fled to the homeland of his ancestors, where he lived with his uncle Laban for many years. While working for Laban, Laban, however you want to pronounce it, Jacob married his daughters Leah and Rachel. He married his daughters Leah and Rachel and began to raise a family. He eventually returned to Canaan and reconciled with Esau. God changed Jacob's name to Israel. His 12 sons became the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. God also reaffirmed to Jacob that the covenant he had made with his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham. One of Jacob's 12 sons was named Joseph. Clearly, Jacob's favorite son. Though one of the youngest, Joseph had dreams, literally, of one day becoming master over his brothers. His brothers became very angry with him because of this and sold him to slave traders headed to Egypt. Yet God blessed Joseph even while a slave in Egypt. Through a complicated interplay of circumstances, Joseph was eventually brought before Pharaoh himself to interpret Pharaoh's dream. God gave Joseph wisdom to understand that the dream foretold a coming worldwide famine. As a result, Pharaoh made him second in command of all of Egypt in order to prepare. During the famine, Joseph's brothers were forced to travel to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph. So during the famine, Joseph's brothers were forced to travel to Egypt to buy grain from him. Though they did not know he was their long-lost brother, eventually Joseph revealed his identity to them, and they reconciled. Joseph convinced his entire family, including his father Jacob, to move to Egypt. And there Jacob's descendants flourished and multiplied. We went through that. If you jump in the my playlist or whatever, the Genesis playlist for the Genesis series and the Job, we jumped into that. All right. The birth of Israel. Many years later, a new leader rose in Egypt, who did not know all that Joseph had done. And he began to oppress the Israelites for fear that they might rebel against him. The Israelites were made slaves, and eventually Pharaoh even ordered all of the Israelite babies' boys to be thrown into the Nile River. One Israelite couple, however, hid their baby boy in a basket in the river and kept him from being killed. Pharaoh's daughter found the baby and adopted him and called him Moses. Moses grew up in the Egyptian royal court. One day he witnessed an Egyptian beating an Israelite. So Moses killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. When Pharaoh found out, Moses fled to the land of Midian. There God spoke to Moses from a burning bush, revealing his name, the Lord, and telling him to go back to Egypt and lead his people out of slavery to the land that God was giving them. Moses was reluctant to go, but the Lord assured him that he would be with him and would give him the power to do amazing miracles before Pharaoh. God also sent Moses' brother, Aaron, along with him to Egypt. When Moses arrived in Egypt, he spoke to Pharaoh, telling him God's command to let the Israelites go out to the wilderness to worship God. Pharaoh refused and then treated the Israelite even more harshly. This set in motion a series of 10 plagues that God inflicted on Egypt. Each plague cycle followed essentially the same pattern. Moses told Pharaoh to let God's people go. Pharaoh refused. The plague was unleashed. Pharaoh refused and the plague was unleashed. Pharaoh recanted an agreement to let the Israelites go. Moses prayed for the plague to be supported. Pharaoh then changed his mind and refused to let the Israelites go. The final plague was a curse upon the firstborn of all the people and animals in Egypt. All homes without blood of a lamb smeared on the doorframe would be visited by the angel of death. The firstborn sons of Egypt were killed by the angel that night, including Pharaoh's own son. The annual feast of Passover commemorates this monumentous event. After the 10th plague, Pharaoh allowed the Israelites to leave Egypt. But once they had left, he again changed his mind and set out in pursuit of them. Just as Pharaoh's army was closing in on the Israelites, who were blocked by the Red Sea, the Lord miraculously parted the sea and allowed the Israelites to pass through on dry land. When the Egyptians tried to follow them, the sea closed over them and they drowned. This whole event, the Exodus, became a defining moment in the history of the nation of Israel when God decisively rescued and redeemed his people for himself. Repeatedly throughout the Old Testament, God would refer to himself as the one who led the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt with strength and miraculous signs. With the threat of the Egyptians behind them, the Israelites were now free to journey to a place where God wanted them to worship him. They began to grumble for food, so God provided quail for meat, and each morning manna, mysterious bread-like flakes, fell from heaven. At times, God also provided water from a rock. Finally, the Israelites came to Mount Sinai, and God met with Moses there. God gave the 10 Commandments and other instructions to give to the people. These essentially define what it meant to live as the people of God. While the Israelites were at Sinai, God also gave Moses instructions for building the tabernacle, which would serve as a sort of portable temple as the Israelites moved from place to place on their way to the land that God had promised the ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Even while Moses was receiving God's law, however, the people demonstrated their persistent unfaithfulness by constructing an idol and worshiping it. And Moses' brother Aaron, who had just been appointed high priest over the Israelites, was the one who instructed them to build it. After the Israelite had camped at the foot of Mount Sinai for a year, God directed them to begin making their way to the promised land. God told Moses to send 12 scouts into Canaan. All but Joshua and Caleb, that's C-A-L-E-B, Caleb, reported that the land was good, but that the inhabitants were stronger than them. So the Israelites refused to take possession of the land. Because they failed to trust in God for victory, he condemned them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until the entire generation had died, except for Joshua and Caleb. God continued to provide for his people during those 40 years. Despite their repeated instances of grumbling and unfaithfulness to him. At the end of the 40 years, the new generation of the Israelites came to Kadesh Barnea. That's KADESH BARNEA, Kadesh Barnea, and they began making their way to the promised land once again. They set up camp on the plains of Moab. The promised land lay just across the Jordan River to the west. Moses reviewed the history of God's dealing with them up to that point and exhorted them to be faithful to God after they conquered the land. Moses died just before the Israelites entered the land, leaving his assistant, Joshua, to lead the conquest. All right, everybody, we're reading a chronological survey of the Bible. I'm Reverend Ced. Thank you for joining me. I play your last playing the board. Possessing the land. The first city to be taken was the imposing city of Jericho, which stood just across from the Jordan River in Canaan. But the Israelites did not even have to lay a siege in the city or attack its gates or attack its gate to capture it, because God miraculously caused the walls of the city to fall down. Now, now I'm getting WWE vibes. Okay, the first city to be taken was the imposing city of Jericho, which stood just across from the Jordan River in Canaan. But the Israelites did not even have to lay a siege to the city or attack its gates to capture it, because God miraculously caused the walls of the cities to fall down. Break the wall down! Joshua then led the Israelites to capture towns throughout the promised land. The entire conquest of the land occurred over many years, but they never fully completed it. God commanded the Israelites to completely drive out the Canaanites, but they were satisfied to simply live alongside the inhabitants. Several areas within the land continued to be controlled by the Canaanites, even after the conquest period was over, and their idolatry was a snare to the Israelites for centuries to come. After Joshua died, God repeatedly raised up leaders called judges to deliver his promises from oppression. This oppression was typically a direct result of the Israelites' sin. This cycle of sin, oppression, and deliverance occurred throughout the period of the judges. During this time, the Israelites also experienced conflicts among themselves as the tribe of Benjamin was almost completely wiped out by the other tribes in a bloody civil war. The period of the judges was a spiritually dark, chaotic times for the Israel and all the people doing whatever seemed right in their own eyes. All right, everybody. We're going to wrap it up for now. But please come back and we'll finish reading a chronological survey of the Bible. I'm Reverend Ced. Thank y'all so much for joining me. Stay blessed.